On January 24th, 1961, a young Robert Zimmerman, green around his ears and straight out of Hibbing, Minnesota, stepped out of a taxi, or if his tales are to be believed, a freight train, and got his first glimpse of the Big Apple, New York City. The ambitious 19-year-old would soon make a name for himself. From Nashville to London, that name would be written in shining lights.
Do you think of yourself primarily as a singer or as a poet?
Well, I think of myself more as a song and dance man, you know.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about Dylan is that he sort of spans this from the era of the beat poets and the beatniks and folk music through the civil rights thing that was going on in the mid-60s.
Bob Dylan and his music served as both a platform and a catalyst for social and political change, as shown in the anti-war sentiments and civil rights movements of his time. Bob Dylan initially rejected the electric sound his contemporaries were moving to, and instead looked to the past, taking up an acoustic guitar and harmonica in order to mimic the folk style of his hero, Woody Guthrie, thus joining the ranks of the rapidly growing folk revival movement. At the start of his journey into serious musicianship, he traveled to New York as a personal pilgrimage in order to visit his revered idol.
Right. Well, Woody Guthrie, I think a lot of people thought of him as what they call the Dust Bowl troubadour. You know, and the Dust Bowl was the terrible. Was when Oklahoma was just overrun by, dust storm, and so Woody Guthrie, did a lot of his music about that era, and so that would be the influence he had, the sort of thing that captured Dylan's imagination. I think that, and then probably the blues to some extent. I don't think he ever thought of himself early on as a rocker. He wasn't trying to be the next Elvis or something like that.
During this time, Guthrie was lying on his deathbed in Greystone Park Hospital, affected by Huntington's disease. But prior to these days of sickness, throughout the 1930s and 40s, Guthrie had traveled the Southwest singing songs about the poor and downtrodden. Meeting with Guthrie regularly in his last days, Dylan befriended the broken man, even dedicating a song to him. Forging onto a settled in ground zero for the politically charged musician revolution, Dylan soon made a name for himself in the coffee houses of the beat poets and rubbed elbows, with big names like Allen Ginsberg and Joan Baez, with whom he struck up a short relationship with. Joan Baez even functioned to further propel Dylan's popularity. As the queen of folk movement, she held considerable sway and influence within the public eye.
Yeah, she was, you don't want to call her a sponsor, but she really promoted his career. She had started out before he had, and became someone who was one of his strongest advocates.
With inventive lyrics and a nasally voice, Bob Dylan followed in the steps of the men from the Dust Bowl. Beyond Guthrie, Dylan pulled influence from Hank Williams, Robert Johnson, and Little Richard, as he brought their sound and style to a new generation. With this steeping in folk music and ties to faith through a Jewish upbringing, Dylan would grow into a social leader of the 1960s.
Darkness at the break of noon, shadows even the silver spoon, the handmade blade, the child's balloon, eclipses.
Though he never referred to himself as a leader, and spurned the term if people applied it to him, there is no escaping that this cultural icon was a prominent spokesperson for his generation. Early on, he worked quite a bit with CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, thanks to his early girlfriend Susie Rodolo, who famously appears on the cover of Free Willin', Bob Dylan.
CORE was the Congress of Racial Equality, the Chicago-based organization that worked for civil rights. It was one of the 3 or 4 main civil rights organizations of this era, and it worked to organize protests and demonstrations against segregation in the South.
Between her influence and meeting Guthrie, Dylan became the activist singer that the world will forever see him as. Thanks to her, Dylan began writing and performing numerous protest songs, starting in 1962 when he performed his first protest song, The Death of Emmett Till, at a CORE benefit This started Dylan on the route to becoming one of the musicians who participated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963 on August 28th.
The March on Washington, as you know, we know it now because of the King's speech that was given there. But the King's speech was part of this much larger march. It was actually called the March for Jobs and Freedom. And it was partly for civil rights and partly also for labor rights. And Bob Dylan was among the musicians who were based around the Washington Monument in the hours leading up to the march, in kind of what you might call a pre-march event of organizing and bringing people together and entertainment.
This famous march brought 250,000 men, women, and children to the nation's capital to hear Martin Luther King Jr.'s historic "I Have a Dream" speech, as well as the songs about the racial inequalities of the 1960s played by well-known artists of the time. Dylan had a lasting effect on those who stopped to listen to him, touching them emotionally and often changing their view on controversial issues. During the march, Dylan played and sang with his girlfriend of the time, Joan Baez. Around this time, Dylan's songs, "Blowing in the Wind" and "The Times Are A-Changing" quickly became anthems for those a part of the civil rights movement, making Dylan, among many other things, the spiritual leader. In this chaotic decade, his hot-button trials, sometimes even swaying the jury. For instance, he wrote the song "Oxford Town" about the racially fueled riots in Oxford, Mississippi, and the song "Hurricane" about the wrongful imprisonment and trial of the black boxer Reuben "Hurricane" Carter for a murder he didn't commit. However, racial issues were not the only subject of Dylan's songs. He also released a song entitled "Masters of War," which was highly critical on the military complex, and wrote numerous other tackling topics as varied as the fear of nuclear war and poverty.
He was one of them.
He was our idol.
Bob was our hero.
During Dylan's prime, he influenced the songwriting and topics of his peers, including the Beatles, whom he actually introduced to marijuana when they arrived in New York, leading them to eventually try acid, influencing the psychedelic music they later put out. This influence can be heard throughout the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. With each hit song that Dylan crafted, more and more people, including other musicians, began to appreciate him. Groups such as Peter, Paul and Mary and the Byrds are some of the most famous to cover Bob Dylan's songs that proved him to be not only a pioneer in the genre, but a visionary in the world of social disorder. Dylan brought the ugly issues that many tried to sweep under the rug to the forefront of the public conscience. He forced the gaze of the public to their own wrongdoing. People in the nation now had a figure that was speaking about the most important issues of the time, but was not a politician, but a man just like them. A song and dance man with something to say. However, the world he started and helped support is not yet done. Though he helped push change and things improved, injustice still remains in this nation. The case of Trayvon Martin and other high-profile cases revolving around the senseless deaths of black citizens is evidence of this. Half a century later, Dylan's songs are still relevant. One man even tweaked the song, "The Lonesome Death of Haiti Carroll," in order to topically be about Trayvon Martin. The Lonesome Death of Trayvon Martin.
But you philosophize disgrace and criticize.
Dylan's legacy is embodied in those who fight against injustice and inequality, whether through the powerful and emotional instrument of music like Dylan, in the protests on the street, social media, the halls of government, or even school classrooms. Those who believe that the world can be better than it is and make the decisions to do something about it are living in the legacy of Bob Dylan, the song and dance man.